Welcome back. Well, the World Bank is now forecasting that our continent's economy will grow by around 3.4%. But the bank also says that actually faster growth and, crucially, more equitable growth is needed to properly reduce poverty. The bank says one of the main reasons for this is that inflation is declining, which means that you should have more money in your pocket and thus able to spend more. But there are still problems with high inequality in Africa, and obviously, of course, in southern Africa. Andrew Dabalen is the World Bank chief economist for the African region. Mr. Dabalen, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. You believe there are now some signs of an economic recovery in Africa. You say fragile. What are you basing that on?
Thank you, Stephen, for having me on your program. So we are predicting a rebound in economic activity from about 2.6% in 2023 to 3.4% in 2024. And we forecast that, in fact, this might rise to 3.8% in 2025. This is primarily driven by private consumption, as declining inflation, as you just mentioned, boosts the purchasing power of household incomes. But we also say that, in fact, more than expected resilience in the global economy has been helpful. Now, two other sources of fund, usually that are reliable sources of growth, such as investment growth and government consumption, are going to be subdued this year because investment still is dragged down by high interest rates because of what the central bankers are doing to control inflation. And government consumption is going to be constrained because of high levels of debt, and these countries are fiscally consolidating.
How important is inflation as a factor? I mean, one of the reasons we've had high inflation, we came out of the pandemic, but also for many countries in Africa, the war in Ukraine had a huge impact on food prices, did in other countries, other parts of the world too. But how important is inflation? If inflation doesn't come down as you think it will that literally throw that growth out the window?
Yes, indeed. Thankfully, inflationary pressures are actually cooling. So the median inflation in the region is projected to fall from 7% to 5% in 2024. And that is through a combination of, normalized global supply chains, steady decline of commodity prices, and, as we mentioned, the impact of this monetary tightening and fiscal consolidation. Now, there have been other recent drivers of inflation, such as high food prices because of all the shocks in the global economy and weakening domestic currencies. But those are also easing in a lot of these countries. Now, having said that, a dozen or so countries in Africa are still really battling about, double-digit inflation, and so they're completely not out of the woods. But even in those countries, inflation has been coming down, although it remains high. So this is important for economic recovery in general.
One of the other problems is that many countries in Africa are facing high levels of debt. We talk about debt costs too in South Africa. Could that be an issue? Is that something governments need to get on top of?
Indeed. So debt actually does affect growth in two ways. Directly, because what happens is that governments have to basically rein in their consumption and investment. So, for example, on average in 2023, African countries spent 47% of their revenues on debt service. That is a lot of money that is not devoted to infrastructure, to health and education investments. So that is a real problem. Indirectly, what happens when debt levels are very high is that, in fact, governments might have to raise taxes in order to be able to close the gap between spending and revenues. And that will weigh down on private consumption of households, and so that also actually drags down growth. And then the other issue is that when governments spend too much, fiscal deficits widen. The central bankers might have to step in and raise interest rates because high fiscal deficits are usually associated with high levels of inflation. And when high interest rates are prevailing, then investments will also be dragged down, and that also affects growth. So this is something very, very important for African governments to get a hold of.
We all know that our continent needs stronger economic growth to basically bring people out of poverty. What kind of policies do you think they should be following? I mean, is there a need for big changes to policies in Africa at the moment?
Indeed. So at the moment, a lot of these countries are dealing with, just a lot of macro instability or fears of macro instability. So I think the most important thing is these foundational issues, to stay focused on fiscal stability and debt, bringing down debt. And that will mean better debt management, including maybe restructuring and reprofiling of debt where necessary, better and transparent budgeting processes, more domestic resource mobilization, for sure. But what we're proposing is that African countries' growth is dragged down by high levels of inequality, and so there is real urgency to equalize opportunities early in life through access to public services such as foundational learning, better nutrition, better health, and then also targeting underserved areas and populations. And then finally, we think that governments can actually really jumpstart growth by removing all kinds of obstacles to market access, obstacles that have to do with regulations, licensing, anti-competitive policies, all kinds of tax distortions, discriminatory laws. All these barriers to trade and to market access can be removed, and it will usher a much more robust growth in the region.
In other words, for you, make it a bit easier for entrepreneurs, make it easier to trade, and let's see what happens.
Exactly.
In South Africa and Southern Africa, we've seen relatively low levels of growth. I mean, our forecasts for our economy are sort of around, 1%, far lower than the rest of Africa. Are there reasons to believe that we're different to the rest of Africa? As I'm sure you're aware, we've had huge problems with electricity. That seems to be getting better. We're very high unemployment, and higher unemployment actually than in most of the rest of the continent, certainly higher inequality. Is lower growth a consequence of all of that?
Indeed. So I think in Southern Africa is dragged down by years and years of underperformance in terms of growth. Growth has been low, and when you have that level of low growth, it's very difficult to create jobs and to actually reduce poverty. So just to give you an example, even the growth that we're projecting now, which is 3.4%, if you adjust for population growth in the region, which is running at around 2.5%, that is barely 1% per capita. And Southern Africa is lower than that, especially in South Africa. And when you have those levels of growth, even when African countries had twice as fast growth, for example, in 2000 to 2014, that 15-year period, per capita GDP growth was about 2.5%. So it was more than twice what we are witnessing now. And even then, it had one of the slowest levels of poverty reduction in the world compared to, say, South Asia or East Asia, right? So in most cases, African growth just has it travels at half the speed of the rest of the world when it comes to translating growth to poverty reduction. And Southern Africa is one of these regions that have been stuck in this low growth. So it's just not enough. And part of the reason is exactly what you pointed out, which is that infrastructure quality has deteriorated substantially. State capacity has deteriorated to deliver services has deteriorated substantially. And the structural inequalities that have been there historically have not really been reduced substantially. So a combination of these things have been the reason why we see low growth in Southern Africa.
It's kind of regionalized, isn't it? I mean, so often as South Africans we talk about, we have the highest unemployment, and we forget that Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia all have, almost very similar levels of high unemployment. What I'm trying to get to is, would it be possible for one country in Southern Africa to sort of buck the trend and maybe bring other countries in Southern Africa along with it? Or are we all kind of tied together in a sort of mining economy that's really 100 years old?
I think the center of gravity in Southern Africa is South Africa. It's the most dominant economy, it's the largest economy in terms of just its diversification, its industrial base, its population, and so on. And so I think getting South African economy going will pull the rest of the region up. And there's absolutely no doubt about that. Now, other countries in the region, of course, can grow. I mean, Botswana has done extremely well in terms of how it manages its resources. And so there's a lot to learn from that. But I think the real driver is always going to be from what happens in South Africa. And so if South Africa can really begin to grow much faster and sustain that for a long period of time, it will certainly lift the rest of the region and also the rest of Africa, to be honest with you.
I suppose the same happens in other parts of Africa too. So, for example, the conflict in Sudan, really, I suppose the civil war, has an impact on the countries around Sudan. We've seen the coups in West Africa that almost seem to, be countries copying each other. I realize they each have their own story, although the cause, in the way, is still the insurgency in the Sahel region. What I'm trying to get to is growth, I presume, is regionalized. If you have a conflict in Sudan, other countries are affected by that. If one country in the Sahel has a coup, other countries will be affected by that. And there's a real lesson about how there's sort of quite high levels of interconnectedness.
Yes, you're pointing out to something very important, which is the possibility of a contagion here, which is, there's this, these regional connections that spill over into other countries, even if in fact we are not suffering from the same kind of problem. And, the Horn of Africa is a good example. When you have, a conflict in Sudan and you have, instability in Ethiopia, that affects the entire region because these are two big countries in the region. What happens with these conflicts is, production gets disrupted, for sure, right? Households can't go to their farms. People are displaced. Entrepreneurs can't start businesses. They can't trade, between cities, let alone between countries, within the same country. And so entire production process comes to a halt. And so, and that affects their neighbors, and it affects obviously the populations that are living in these conflict-ridden countries.
I wonder sometimes, Mr. Dabalen, if I may, about the longer-term future for Africa. We all want a better life for our children. We all want our children to be able to grow up and live long, productive, sustainable lives in Africa. We know climate change is going to be a big factor. We see moments of sort of conflict like the one in Sudan. And then we see countries recovering too from conflict, like we've seen in Rwanda, a controversial example, but Sierra Leone, many other places. I kind of wonder the way the global economy is moving, the way that sometimes we see children in Europe and North America really living lives that are defined by the fourth industrial revolution and AI. And I wonder if children on our continent are perhaps being left behind a little bit, which is going to almost betray their future.
Yeah, so I think you're pointing out something very, very important in Africa, which is, what will it take to really begin to change the transformation of the continent. And I think the foundational issues are going to come to, how you bring under control these conflicts. Because once you have a stable economy, you could solve your problems, because you can focus on the more fundamental issues around the structure of the economies you have, the investments you need, and how you can build institutions that actually underpin growth in general. But I think unless these instabilities are brought to a halt, and unless we begin to trade with each other much more by building a lot of, trading corridors, connect to each other, and begin to, regionalize our problems, it's going to be very difficult to actually get out of low growth equilibrium.
Andrew Dabalen, I think you and I could talk for a lot longer about our continent. I really appreciate the time, sir. Thank you very much indeed.